All right, guys. So today I'm going to break down the most popular deadlift tutorial video on YouTube from what I could find. So this is how to perform the deadlift for growth. 5 mistakes you're probably making from Jeremy Ether. From what I could find, this is the most viewed like deadlift tutorial video on YouTube. So it's got almost 9 million views. So I'm going to check in, see what he says. I have never seen this guy's content. It looks like he's got a pretty big following, and we're going to see what he says and if I agree with it. So let's go through this. Let's see what he's saying here.
Add upper back thickness, accentuate your V-taper, and build a powerful looking backside, then deadlifts should definitely be a staple in your routine, as it's one of the best compound exercises to help develop the several muscles that make up your posterior chain. And as shown in this 2011 study from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, not only does the deadlift enable you to lift more weight when compared to any other free weights exercise, but research also indicates that it's an effective tool to use for improving explosive strength and vertical jump performance, making it an all-around effective exercise for size.
Yeah, I mean, that all seems on point. Like the deadlift is one of the best exercises out there. It's going to involve just about all the muscle groups in the body. Obviously, the low back is the primary mover for most people, but you got the hamstrings, you got the glutes, you got the lats, you got all the muscle groups are involved in deadlift. So it's just a phenomenal exercise all around.
Strength and athleticism that should definitely be incorporated into your routine. However, despite the seemingly straightforward movement pattern of the deadlift, if you want to maximize its effectiveness,
Now, right away here, the first thing I'm seeing is he has his shoulders too far back. So his shoulders are a little too far back and his hips are a little too low right here. So this, I don't know if he's going to change things here. I don't know what he's going to go into, but this right here is actually an inefficient starting position. If he starts in this position, his hips are going to shoot up a little bit and his shoulders are going to get pulled forward right when he goes to pull. The other thing, I do not agree with the head in the neutral position. So this is something that I've seen people do for an eternity on squat and deadlift. When the head is down, it's going to pull you forward. So you're going to get pulled forward, especially at the lockout. You're going to have a more inefficient lockout. It's going to be harder to get your hips through. So right here, I mean, this guy, he seems like he's got a, he's trying to help people out. But right away, I just would say shoulders are too far back. He needs to pull his shoulders further forward over the bar, which will raise his hips. The shoulders and hips are going to work in conjunction with one another. So if you raise the hips, the shoulders are going to tilt forward. And then, if you try to get your shoulders forward, your hips are going to raise. So either way, whatever you want to think about as far as your cue, whether it's hips higher or shoulders forward, that's going to be the key. He's squatting down into this a bit too much. And I totally disagree with the head position because that's just going to pull you forward, make an inefficient lockout. You're just really going to get your center of gravity forward when you're trying to lock out if you do that. So a lot of guys try to do this. I've never agreed with it.
while reducing your risk of injury, then there's a lot more that goes into it than simply picking a weight up off the floor. Chances are, if you haven't been coached well on how to properly perform the deadlift, then there's a high probability that you're making a mistake or two.
And here's another thing, like we talked about in previous videos, doing the video with 135 as far as like the tutorial weight, it's just not practical because you can make, anything look pretty good with lighter weight. And it doesn't expose the technical inefficiencies. So the technical inefficiencies that I just said, they're not going to show up with 135. But if he put like 315 plus on, we're going to start to see issues.
For example, if you can't spot at least two of the mistakes I'm making here, then chances are you're likely doing one of them. Therefore, in this video, I'll cover the 5 most common errors people make with a deadlift, and more importantly, I'll show you how to easily fix them right away. One of the most common errors people make with the deadlift is essentially turning it into a squat movement pattern, which is mistakenly done by positioning the hips too low and maintaining an upright back during the setup. And this is problematic because when the hips are positioned too low, your body is placed behind the bar to a greater extent.
Well, hold on. Now, The irony here is the hips are still too low in the right hand video. So he's totally correct. Like, you don't want to squat into the bar. It is the biggest mistake I also see people make. But the real issue here is on the right side with what's the correct form, his hips are still too low. Like, he's squatting down into it too much. Um, you're just definitely not going to pull any serious weight with the hips that low and the shoulders behind the bar. So that's still problematic, and he's on the right track here. But the problem is the right side of what the example is of how to do it properly is still a little wrong. So it's just he needs to shift his shoulders forward, get the hips higher. So this would be, I mean, this is very exaggerated on the left. I don't think anybody's really trying that much, but this is more on the right, more of an example of what I see um, as far as people making mistakes. And like I said, 135 may not expose that, but you put 315, 405 on, even his form on the right is going to get exposed pretty hard.
Is placed behind the bar to a greater extent, which both creates unfavorable leverages that causes more stress on the lower back and it decreases the amount of weight you can lift since your center of gravity isn't placed in an optimal position. So instead, what you want to do is when you're in the starting position, focus on the following two key points. One, while keeping your chest up and back straight, ensure that your hips are positioned between your knees and your head, as opposed to positioning them too low as shown here or too high as shown here. The exact angle will.
Yeah, so the right side now, I mean, this is again exaggerated a bit. That's more like a stiff-legged position. Um, so definitely a little too high, but there's got to be a happy medium. You're going to find that point where there's like the maximum amount of tension through your arms. When you feel that maximum amount of tension through your arms, that's when you're going to be in the most efficient position. So that's one way to kind of gauge it. Play around with your hip height, and when you feel no slack in your arms, because if you have your hips too low, you're going to feel no tension in your arms. If you feel a lot of tension in your arms, you're probably in an ideal position. So this is too high. I agree.
Vary based on your anatomy, but this is a good guideline to follow. And two, ensure that the bar is positioned directly underneath your scapula. If your hips are too low, you'll notice that the bar is now positioned in front of the scapula, which is just an indication that you should readjust your.
I don't know if I'd go off that cue, because here's the problem. Like, we're looking at the left side, which is the correct side, and he's going to get his hips are going to shoot right up when he gets to serious weight. So that doesn't seem to be the best cue, because the scapula would be slightly over the bar rather than in line with it.
Your hip position. Sticking to these 2 points will help ensure that your hips are in the right position.
You notice as well that with that, the bar directly, or the scapula directly in line with the bar again is going to drive right into the shins doing this. So it's just inefficient. You're almost like driving the bar straight into your knees. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that.
These 2 points are the most problematic mistake that lifters make when it comes to this movement and acute back injuries. Ideally, throughout the deadlift and especially
Let
during
me
the pull,
miss something here.
which is just an indication that you should position. Sticking to these 2 points will help ensure that your hips are in the right position. I'm sure you've all witnessed the all too common rounded deadlift at your gym, which is probably the most problematic mistake that lifters make when it comes to this movement and acute back injuries. Ideally, throughout the deadlift and especially during the pull, your spine should remain straight with your head, hips, and back all in line. But if you're struggling with this and you're sure you're not using a weight that's too heavy for you, then first off, what you need to do is change the way you think of the deadlift. Rather than thinking about pulling the weight up from the floor, think about pushing the floor away with your feet as you lift the bar. Similar to how you would push your feet during.
That's actually a pretty good cue. Like, one of the best ways to get that tight setup off the ground with the arms is to think about turning the deadlift into a push where you're getting tension through the arms and pushing the bar away from you. So that's actually a fairly good cue. And like lumbar rounding, yeah, it's gonna be problematic. Most people aren't gonna do that. You're gonna see some degree of upper back rounding. It's gonna vary depending on the person and how they're built. Upper back rounding can allow you to generate a lot more speed off the floor, and it's not something that is necessarily bad. So it's not. The problem is if you're doing a neutral back deadlift, you are going to sacrifice a little speed off the floor, but you're going to have a more efficient lockout and be able to get your hips through. But a lot of power lifters, experienced power lifters, have some degree of rounding to try to generate the most speed possible off the floor. The only difference is the rounding is through the upper back and not the lumbar region, not through the low back. So there is some degree of which you can deadlift with a rounded back position in the upper back, not the lower back.
Leg press. Use this pushing cue for the first 3 to 4 inches of the pull, and then after that, drive your hips forward to complete the pull. This subtle yet effective cue often helps people keep their hips from rising too quickly, which prevents their back from rounding during the pull. Now, in addition to this, a rounded deadlift is essentially a compensation for weak hips, because as shown here, rounding your back actually brings your hips closer to the bar. This gives them a better mechanical advantage, meaning that your hips don't have to work as hard to get the weight up. So to solve this, you need to strengthen your hips. And the best way to go about doing this is to incorporate more hip strength.
No, I would say the glutes and the hamstrings are one reason you're going to see more rounding. Most people are just not going to round to the degree in the video, though. That's, again, a kind of an extreme example. Like, you really aren't going to see too many people do that. And one of the things I really like to do is do trap bar deadlifts with beginners, because trap bar deadlifts are going to automatically put someone in the proper position. It's almost impossible to round. The weight's not going to move if you round. So I love trap bar deadlifts for working with any personal training clients who are older or new. Like, you don't have the risk to the back, and you can load the weight. You can go heavy without having to worry too much about things. Now, one thing on the glute ham raises here, the pad here is too far away from the foot plate. So that's causing this to be somewhat inefficient as far as the glute ham raise form, because he's not doing the full contraction with his hamstrings. He's using his low back to some extent. So I would want to get this pad in closer to the foot plate, and that'll allow me to get way more hamstring isolation out of these. But glute ham raises are a phenomenal exercise.
Strengthening exercises into your routine, like glute ham raises, split squats, and hip thrusts, for example.
Now, I also want to say, so let's just look at the glute ham raise again real quick and see what.
So to solve this, you need to strengthen your hips.
See this angle. See how his low back is a little bowed in here. That should not happen on a glute ham raise. But the whole issue here is the setup. The setup with glute ham raises is everything. The pad is just too far away from the foot plate. That's the main issue.
And the best way to go about doing this is to incorporate more.
He's somewhat taking the hamstrings out of the equation with that. He needs to have that closer, and that'll isolate the hamstrings much further.
More hip strengthening exercises into your routine, like glute ham raises, split squats, and hip.
Now on the split squat here, the front foot is way too far out from the bench. We want to bring that front foot in much closer to the bench if you're trying to isolate the glutes and quads. I like that he's actually being upright here. He's staying upright, which is awesome. But this is going to make it very, very difficult to balance. I would shift that front foot in about a foot closer to the bench. That'll allow you to come down straight, touch the back knee to the floor, and power up with the quads and the glutes. So this is just too far from the bench.
Hip thrust, for example. Focusing on these exercises in combination with the deadlift cue.
Hip thrust looks good, getting a nice glute squeeze at the top. People do hip thrusts without trying to focus on squeezing the glutes. So I like doing these for high reps with lighter weight. You get more out of them than going heavy.
Earlier will make a big difference in improving your lift. In order to perform an efficient deadlift, the barbell path needs to be as short as possible from start to finish. And that means that it needs to ideally travel in a perfectly vertical line, such that the final position of the bar should be directly over where it was on the floor. However, a common mistake people make is either having the bar start too far away from them when on the ground, or not keeping the bar as close as possible to the body when performing a rep. Instead, what you want to do is first place the bar over your midfoot. Then, as you lift the weight up... Instead, what you want to do is first place the...
This is actually pretty good. This bar position is much better than the Mark Ripito video as far as the starting position. So totally agree with this. Just looks like a far more efficient starting position here. It's closer to what I would go with.
The bar over your midfoot. Then, as you lift the weight off the floor, do so by dragging it as close to your shins and thighs as possible to ensure it's being lifted in a vertical line. And to most effectively accomplish this, you need to focus on engaging your lats through.
You want to keep the bar as close as possible without actually hitting the shins on the way up. Because if you hit the shins on the way up, it's going to act as a braking mechanism, and the friction is going to slow you down tremendously. So you won't be fast at all. You're not going to pull a big weight if you're scraping your shins up all the time. So the only exception I would say is people who have longer arms, shorter torsos, and shorter legs. They might be able to achieve a more vertical shin position where they can keep the bar in far closer by getting their weight back better. But that's a very small percentage of the population who have the leverages to be able to pull like that. But you're literally going to have long arms, short torso, short legs, and you'll be able to pull with a more vertical shin position where you may get a little shin contact with the bar. But for most people, you do not want to be grazing the shins on the way up.
Throughout the movement. To do this, before you pull, think about essentially performing a straight arm pull down with the bar in order to engage the lats. As shown here, you should feel your lat muscles activated and turned on as a result of this. And you want to maintain this lat engagement as you pull the bar up from the floor during each rep, since this will help with your bar path and with your overall stability. And if you're struggling with feeling this, what you can do is attach a band to the bar and pull backwards against the band by using your lats, and then perform a few light reps while keeping your lats engaged. This should help you learn what it feels like to properly use your lats during the deadlift.
Yeah, I think I like that he's talking about tension through the lats. The only thing I would say though is I disagree as far as like how I would go about thinking about that. And there's a million ways to think about it, but I would think about pushing down into the bar to create that tension, like almost pushing my shoulders down, which you're going to feel your lats tighten. You're going to feel your lats tighten down when you push your shoulders down. So we're going to create that tension through the arms, just like I talked about. And that's what's really going to engage the lats pretty well. But I mean, it's really a good cue what he's talking about. I just would go about saying it in a different manner.
Another really common mistake people make with the deadlift is jerking the weight off the floor from a relaxed position. And what happens when you do this is you're not generating the muscular tension needed prior to the lift, which as a result often leads to back pain or discomfort and makes the lower back more likely to round as you lift the weight. To address this, what you want to do is after you set up properly, the last thing you should do before lifting the weight is raise your chest up while slightly pulling up on the bar to generate tension before the pull. Only after you do this small step should you then proceed to perform your rep. The deadlifts should be finished with solid.
Yeah, that was a pretty good cue. I'm in agreement with that. You pull the slack out. Don't just try to jerk the bar because I see a lot of times where people have bend in their arms when they're pulling up on the bar, and it's just going to cause you to lose tension, and you're not going to be as efficient and strong. So I definitely like the cue as far as like getting tension through the arms and trying to pull the slack out before you initiate the pull. That's good stuff.
Hip extension, meaning that you're contracting your glutes and feeling them activate. And your hips are pushed forward until the bar stops them from traveling any further. What a lot of people do, however, is continue on by hyperextending the lumbar spine and leaning back at the top position, which is unnecessary and causes a lot of stress on the lower back. And for some, this may be just due to a technical error and can be fixed by simply avoiding an excessive lean back at the top. But for many people, it's a result of an anterior pelvic tilt or just not knowing how to properly contract the glutes and posteriorly tilt the pelvis during the deadlift, in which I'd highly suggest watching my video on anterior pelvic tilt, which will show you how to address these issues. And for those interested, I'll leave a link to this video in the description box down below. That's pretty much it for
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good cue as well to not hyperextend at the top, squeeze the glutes, engage the glutes, and you're not going to have as many issues. So, he's on the right track. Like, it's a decent video. There's just a few subtleties that are off. And part of the reason is the weight, like we talked about, like doing a tutorial video with 135, you're just not going to see these things get exposed. So there were some issues, but overall, decent video. just he's on the right track. He's got good ideas. There's just a few little subtle things I would change. So now, if you're interested in seeing like what I think as far as a proper deadlift, check out my deadlift tutorial video. It's on my page. Be on my homepage if you go to it, and I'll break it down. It's with 485, so I try to use heavier weight to kind of show things that would really carry over. So, like I said, with lighter weights, things are just going to get exposed, but heavier weight, you can kind of see that any inefficiencies come out. And if you guys like this kind of content, give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe for the sake of the algorithm growing the channel. I appreciate it big time. Try to get back to some of the comments. Channel's growing so fast, I can't necessarily get back to all the comments, but I'm trying to get back to a lot of them on these videos I'm posting and be pretty interactive with you guys. So I appreciate it big time, guys, and I'm out.